Welcome to the Long Range Pursuit Podcast, presented by Gunworks, where we learn about and share long-range shooting techniques, science, and gear.
Welcome back to another episode of the Long Range Pursuit Podcast. And today we are joined by Chris Hinojosa, a member of our sales team, and Brian Poor, training director at Long Range University. And today we're going to talk about zeroing and truing your rifle. So how we do it, why we do it, what are some things you can look out for, and whatnot there. So we'll jump right into zeroing. And as far as I can remember, we at Gunworks had been zeroing most of our rifles at 200 yards with BDC turrets. And
I think everybody has. I think 200 yards has kind of always been the standard, right? You zero a rifle at 200 yards.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. I wonder if some of that's not just a holdover from that concept of before we had turrets. You know, we always used to zero at 200 because it gave you that kind of point blank range out to like 250.
Yeah.
You know, so if it's just part of it's a holdover from that habit, you know, because even if I zero my rifle at 100 yards, you know, when I go carry it in the field, I'm probably going to set it for 200 for carrying around. So I still have that same benefit.
yeah, I think it's just passed down generations. My grandpa always taught me we zero, inch and a half high at 100 puts us dead on at 200.
Yeah.
That's burned into my brain,
Yeah.
like being able to friggin' walk. That's what you do, right?
Yeah.
And of course that was on a fixed 4-power scope, and
which is hard to do.
So that's why you shot an inch and a half high at 100 yards, because you can forget a group at 200.
Yeah.
Fixed 4-power scope and a 308. It's like that. It just wasn't working real well for me, especially when I was a kid. So a big holdover there. We didn't. What is a turret? A turret is the thing you adjusted with a nickel to get it to zero. Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a different conversation than it is now. So.
Yeah, and I think also too, if you look at ballistic turrets, when we first started doing BDCs, we'd use a 200-yard zero, because if you had a 20 or 25 minute total revolutions on your turret, your chances of getting to 1,000 yards on that first revolution were a little bit better if you had a 200-yard zero versus a 100-yard zero, because you're usually right at that threshold.
Yeah, with a 20-minute turret or something, everything now's got 30 or the Collis got 40 minutes now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we used to run those old G7 scopes, and they were 20-minute turrets. So what do you think about a 7 rem mag with a 200-yard zero? You could get to 1,000 yards with 20 minutes.
Yeah, but you wouldn't get there with a 100-yard zero. It was like right there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, but recently we've moved over to exclusively 100-yard zeros, and that's what you're teaching at the Long Range University as well, correct?
Yeah, I think 100 yards is a lot easier for folks to shoot.
Yeah.
And so when they shoot a group at 100 yards, everybody's looking for that 1-inch group. And so if you shoot that 1-inch group at 100 yards, people feel like, okay, I know exactly where that is. It's a pretty precise spot, so they feel like it's a good zero. You have them shoot at 200 yards, and even if they shoot a 2-inch group at 200 yards, which is theoretically the exact same thing, they don't feel like it's that precise. I think just there's something psychologically about it where they just don't trust it as much, or they get frustrated because they don't feel like they're shooting good enough to trust that zero. So I think it's a lot easier to get folks to shoot a good group at 100 yards than it is at 200 yards for some reason.
It's because the amount of paper between the bullet holes is scary.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly it. If you do the math, they probably shot just as well, but psychologically they feel like they didn't shoot that well.
Yeah.
So I think 100-yard zero works very well, and it's a good starting point. And 100-yard ranges are very easy to find. And just like with Chris and I, it was burned into our heads. Hey, inch and a half high at 100, but then I get a lot of clients that have our older systems that have a 200-yard zero, and they're like, well, we're only shooting 100 yards. How are we going to do this?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't burned into their brain. That hey, well, we just need to put it in the case of the cartridges we're shooting now about 1.2 inches high.
Yep.
Because they're a little flatter shooting than the older cartridges. They just don't get that, so I think it just simplifies things doing 100-yard zero. And then you combine that with the fact that we have a 100-yard indoor range.
Yeah.
That's probably a good benefit as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Have you Brian's not old and I'm less old, but you're far from old. Have you had any experience with rifles, I mean, was like ballistic turret kind of a thing when you jumped into it now?
When I first started hunting, I mean, I was 12 or 13. It was with a Leupold VX3, 3.5 to 10, right? So as soon as I
3.5 to
got
10.
Yeah.
That'll date you a little bit because when did they go to that 3.5 to 10? That was probably, 2000
I mean,
something.
I want to say I got my first Very X3 3.5 to 10, and I had custom mill dots put in it and target turrets put on it, probably in about 1992.
You probably used a fixed 10X Leupold for duty rifle.
Actually, I used a fixed 10 Unital.
Oh, jeez.
We kind of wanted the Leopolds, but
Yeah.
the Marine Corps didn't have them.
Nice. So that's something that's new, I guess.
Yeah.
And not to make fun of you at all, but yeah, 3.5 to 10 is. I've got a 3.5
I'm
to
with the
10. I
times,
still shoot
yeah.
it. But mine's a CDS. My 3.5 to 10 is a CDS. So that's
It's one of those
fancy.
It's one of those newfangled ones.
Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't. I mean, in that era, I guess we all went to MOA or MRAD turrets, to adjust for elevation. Right. I didn't know how to use them the first one I saw, but shooting prairie dogs with a turret that adjusts, and then still with the mill dot reticle and how much holdover I had at 2 and 3 and 500 yards for prairie dogs. I could have just been. That wasn't necessary. Yeah.
But yeah, as I've really gotten involved with it, that wasn't until about 2017, 2016 when I really started to get into long range stuff. So I was always been a 100-yard zero guy. That's all I've ever really known. So yeah. I don't understand the old folk stories of your time of 200-yard zeros.
Folk stories. Yeah. You got to shoot them fast cartridges so that it's, Mine shoots point of aim out to 275, which is better than your 225.
Yep.
Now we shoot those.
It kicks me a little harder, but it's worth it.
Yeah, dang near offhand, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
At those kind of distances. Sorry, I'm getting a sidetracked as usual.
That's all right. But no, so I think, whether you get 100 or 200 yard zero probably doesn't matter from a practical standpoint. I think the reason we switched is just number one, because the 100-yard range, number two, because it's easier for people to shoot at 100 yards. And with, like Chris said, with modern turrets having more adjustment on one revolution, we can get to 1,000 yards on one revolution, with most calibers and scopes, with 100-yard zero.
You think about all we're doing with adjustments in scopes and ballistics and all that, it's all math, right? It's all the numbers. And so people tend to work in a 1 scale a lot better than they do a 2 scale. So it's like people will actually say, well, my 1 inch group is how far low, how far left. It's 1 inch low and 1 inch left. Okay, well, I'll move it 4 clicks to move it 1 inch. And people just can't calculate that 2 inches now means that, at 200 yards to make those adjustments. And we go back to the whole, it's like we always revert to the Kentucky windage thing. It's about 3 clicks. What do you mean it's about 3 clicks? It's 2 inches, or, it's 1 inch low and left. So that's half an MOA. So that would be 2 clicks. We go back to guessing once we get away from that 1 scale.
Yeah.
It's just generation upon generation of winging it.
Yep.
And we need to think about what we're doing now. All this long range shooting is precision math.
Yep.
And use real numbers to do real things. So.
Yep. No, good point.
Some people tend to overlook, I think.
Yeah. Zeroing is one of the most important factors when it comes to setting up your gun and getting a profile made. With the next being validating your rifle and your trajectory.
And just one thing I want to add on zeroing before we move on is, you always want to make sure you zero from, the most stable position possible. But on the same token, you want to make sure that position kind of approximates, your field position. So like if you look how we teach bench shooting, we teach really high seat, squared up, leaning forward against the bench. So if I look at someone's upper body in relationship to the bench and the rifle, when they're shooting off the bench, it's not that much different than we'd be in the prone. Yeah. Just how their upper body is, their relationship between their upper body and that rifle. Because we try to keep that consistency from position to position so that we don't see any position-related zero changes. So you want your zero position to give you a good field zero. Therefore, your bench shooting position has to approximate the way that rifle recoils from your field positions.
Yep.
Something we hear a lot, actually, on the sales end of it. And say, we build a custom rifle for somebody. and they get it home, and one of the first things we tell them is, hey, that was zeroed here. We zeroed it, when we were doing our validation. But everybody's got a little bit different eyesight, so maybe their eye relief issues, maybe they're not getting their parallax correct, focus, and then everybody addresses the rifle differently. If somebody hasn't been out to our classes and somebody's still in the old school mentality of, I call it bladed to the rifle, to where, they have a bench with a big old cutout on it, and then they're resting, let's say the right-handed shooter, that rifle is bladed across their chest quite a bit instead of them being squared up perpendicular. Then that rifle's going to recoil differently, and they're going to have a different point of impact, I guess. And so when we say we send it out zeroed, we send it out zeroed with somebody who, we hope knows how to shoot. And you get it to the end user, and maybe they haven't had the training, and maybe their rifle comes out zeroed. So when you get your new Gunworks rifle, you need to check the zero on it. Because what happens if you're not zeroed? I mean, what does that do to you downrange? Yeah. Let's say what happens if your rifle is shooting 1 inch low for you?
That just gets expanded,
Yeah, I mean, it's 1 minute low all the way out, but you combine that 1 minute low, and people go, okay, that's only 6 inches of 600 yards. But if I combine that with the fact that rifle's potentially shooting probably a 6-inch group, odds are that bullet could theoretically be 9 inches lower, because my whole zero is 6 inches low, plus the circle that rifle shoots, the center of that 6 inches low.
Room for error, right? Yeah.
Random chance of where those bullets fall within that 6-inch circle, you could be as much as 9 inches low. And so, I think it's really important that you start precisely zeroed.
Yep. It's going to help you further eliminate some issues downrange. So being able to have a good zero, you'll be able to check that box and eliminate from other factors. But leading into truing your rifle. So what is truing your rifle? Why do we do it?
Well, truing...
Have at it.
And say truing your rifle is basically when we run a ballistic profile, whether it's in our Revic app or whether it's in any one of the other ballistic programs, we're taking the bullet's velocity with a zero range and that bullet's ballistic coefficient, and the computer is coming up with a predicted trajectory based upon that. And sometimes we'll find that when we actually get out there, that the real life shooting results are slightly different. That could be because our rifle has a little different twist rate than the manufacturer had when they tested the BC of that bullet. There's things that can affect the BC, or it could be just simply because we didn't have access to a chronograph. So we kind of guessed or went off the number on the box when it came to, hey, what's the velocity of this ammunition, which, could be quite a bit different than what's on the box. And even if we have a very similar rifle, like within LRU, we see probably about a 40 to 50 foot per second spread from 6 identical Magnus's 6.5 Creedmoors shooting the same lot number of ammunition on what their average velocity is. Okay, so even if that's even a wild card, so the only way to truly know your velocity is to chronograph the gun. So the best way to do this is to zero at 100 yards, just like we talked about.
Yep.
And then once you're zeroed at 100 yards, and probably while you're doing your 100-yard zeroing, as long as you're not using a chronograph that attaches to your muzzle, if you're using a lab radar, you can gather your velocity data at the same time. You want a pretty good, group of shots to choose from, so you get a good average. So I recommend probably at least 5 shots. And then we're going to plug that velocity into the app along with the bullet and the ballistic coefficient and make sure all our environmentals are correct. And now we're going to shoot. We're going to go straight out to about 80% of the max range we want to shoot. So if I want a system that's capable and I want good data out to 1,000 yards, I want to do my truing at least 800 yards, and that seems, the 80% rule seems to work out pretty well. And so I'm going to go out there, some of the things that can cause this data to be wrong or me to have errors is, I'd say one of the big ones is parallax, because if you got parallax in your scope, I can put my face in the same wrong position on the stock every time,
right,
and shoot a really good group, a minute low or a minute high. And that error was caused by parallax, so make sure your parallax is perfectly adjusted, both when you're zeroed and when you're shooting, your 800-yard validation. And then the other thing that can cause issues is pick a calm day to do it, because things like aerodynamic jump, if I got a 10 mile per hour crosswind, coming from the right, that's 0.4 minutes high. Okay. Coming from the left, that's 0.4 minutes low. So that spread between the two is 0.8 minutes, almost a full minute. of error that I could have in there if I didn't have wind in there properly. So, given a choice, I don't want to try to get a good trajectory on a day when I got to deal with wind. I want a good calm day where wind and aerodynamic jump aren't affecting my trajectory. And then I want to get, 4 or 5 rounds consistently on level, even if I'm chasing a little bit of windage. But if I get 4 or 5 rounds consistently on level, making whatever adjustments I had to the scope until it's hitting, I started with what the ballistic program told me. And let's say, for example, and I'll run this example on my phone here in a minute. Let's say I started at 20 and a half minutes. But when I actually got out there and shot, it actually took me 21 minutes to shoot at 800 yards. So now by going through this truing function, I can enter that data into the truing function, and then the computer will basically reverse engineer it and say, okay, for this to be true, either your ballistic coefficient is this or your velocity is this. And then once you decide how you're going to make that change, when you make that change, all your other yard lines will fall into place. It's not going to carry that half-minute error out to your further yard lines.
Yeah.
So we've now trued that profile for that rifle.
I got you.
That's great.
What, so when you say plug it in the app, I guess we're talking about the Revic Ops app. There are a bunch of other ballistic calculators that do it. They don't really have a truing function like that, right? I guess they have a form of a truing function, but it's probably a whole podcast to try to explain that.
I mean, I used to manually do it just by going in there and in my profile, on some of the computing apps before I was using the Revic app, I would just change my velocity in like 15 or 20 foot per second increments until my data matched. So it's kind of a trial and error type process. Whereas with the Revic, it does it for you.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this up and record my screen. And so using the criteria I just talked about, I started out, I zeroed at 100 yards, and now I'm going to punch in 800 yards, and it's calling for 18.9 minutes. So I shoot it at 19 minutes. I'm going to round it to the nearest quarter. So I shoot it at 19 minutes, and let's say, for example, it really takes me 19 and a half minutes, before I'm getting point of aim, point of impact at 800 yards. So what I'll do is I'll back out of the ballistic calculator. I'll go to my true profiles. I'll make sure that all my environmentals are correct. It's showing me my zero range is 100 yards. And then I'll enter a far range of 800 yards, and then my actual adjustment, which was 19 and a half minutes. And so in this case, it's telling me that for this to be true, either my muzzle velocity must be 27, 29 feet per second.
Instead of what was it?
Honestly, I didn't look to see what it was.
That's
initially.
not helpful.
So it's either making a change to my muzzle velocity.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Or it's saying that the Doppler file on this Hornady bullet, instead of being 1, has to be 0.9255. Now, so how do I decide which adjustment I'm going to make?
Velocity or BC?
Yeah, velocity or BC. Now, if I ran a chronograph and I know what my velocity is, I'll make the adjustment in the BC, because I've eliminated that velocity variable. However, if I didn't run a chronograph, so I kind of made a guesstimation on velocity, then that's probably the biggest variable. Either one is going to get you good results out to 1,000 yards. I think it's really in the ELR shooting that becomes a bit more critical, whether you true velocity or true the ballistic coefficient. But I've seen good results doing it either way. We run classes at school. We don't chronograph each gun.
Yeah.
We just give the students a starting point that's kind of an average for the rifles, and then they true each individual rifle using velocity.
Yeah.
And they have absolutely no issues getting good hits anywhere from 300 to 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
So I think either work in the range that we're talking about. So in this case that I'm talking about here, we're going to say that I knew what my velocity was, and I'm going to hit set BC. So I hit set BC, I confirm that change, and now when I go back into my ballistic calculator, 800 yards is calling for 19.5 minutes. So it basically trued the program to match the real life data with my rifle.
I guess you said your Doppler profile was 1 or 0.9 something. So that's using, with the Hornady bullets, we have a Doppler profile in there for them.
Yeah. So any of the Hornady bullets, we're gonna have a Doppler profile in there for.
Okay.
Okay. And a Doppler profile is 1, And that basically just means it's 100% of what Hornady says it is. So it's not like a traditional ballistic coefficient, like say on a G7 scale, I got one bullet that's a 0.326 and I have another bullet that's 0.350. And I can say that, okay, the 350 bullet's a better bullet than the 326. Every Hornady Doppler file for every bullet is one. And that's just 100% of what Hornady says it is.
Okay.
And sometimes people get a little nervous about changing the ballistic coefficient.
Well, that's data that's provided by the manufacturer. It must be gospel, right?
Yeah. And I look at it as like, first off, there's a set, temperature and air density that they have to establish their BCs at. So that's established. But like your twist rate, that's not established. Okay. And especially in the case of like Doppler or something where it is actually real live fire data, how quickly that bullet goes to sleep in the first 25 yards of flight and how much velocity it loses in that first 25 yards of flight, that's pretty dependent upon twist rate. So if I change my twist rate, I can change the amount of time it takes that bullet to fully stabilize. And therefore, that's going to have a resulting change
in your BC
on what that BC gets calculated at. I'm just guessing here.
Yeah.
But if I was Hornady, I would try a 7, a 7.5, an 8, an 8.5.
Yeah.
And whichever one of those gave me the best number, that would be the BC for that bullet.
Yeah.
So now if we're shooting something different than that, very likely the BC is a little different than the manufacturer says, but it's likely because of a different twist rate. So don't be afraid to change that BC once you've eliminated the other variables.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it's worth noting, considering the velocity is a constant with a really high quality chronograph. I mean, if that's what you're gonna use as your baseline,
that's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Magneto speed and lab radar, notable mentions. But
your shoot through Caldwell or whatever Pro Chrono. I've seen some variances.
Questioned my velocities that it said I was getting many times with some of those older style chronographs. And
it's all right. We products improve over the years.
Yeah.
So they have improved since the original. So it's just
and
all there is to it.
And one thing to talk about ballistic coefficients too, and I think the Doppler profiles eliminate this variable, but most of your other bullet manufacturers are going to assign one BC, and they'll say, okay, this bullet has a BC of 0.326. Well, ballistic coefficients are dependent upon velocity.
Yeah.
So within a velocity threshold of say 2,800 feet per second to 2,300 feet per second, that 326 might be true. However, for a certain bullet from 2,300 feet per second to 1,600 feet per second, that BC may change to 0.3. It's not like it magically changed at that point. That was just the break point. It was a continual migration.
It's where it changed enough to
that they can
make a calculation.
Make a calculation difference. And the reason I bring that up is when you're doing your ELR shooting, when you're really trying to shoot some long distances, if your program only has the ability to calculate for one BC, or if you only have one profile for that certain gun, it's probably based on the higher velocity BC. And to really get good, accurate data for 1,500 or 2,000 yards, we need to take into account what that bullet's BC is when it's down in that 1,300 feet per second threshold. Yeah, which may not be the same as it is for our 800 yard shooting.
Yeah.
So oftentimes we'll actually run two profiles on that, where we have a profile that works out to 1,000, but then we'll build a second profile that gives us good data for those longer shots. Beyond the range of what hunters are likely to shoot, but just for, shooting enthusiasts.
Yeah.
And the ability to hit something at really long range. That's the only way you can true that long range profile without screwing up your main profile for shorter range stuff.
Yeah.
I guess a good example of that is I had this last week in class. Actually, I was getting ready to go shoot a match and had a shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor, and a lot of times I don't use a chronograph. I just go ahead and shoot for drop data, right? And that's what we kind of have taught that over the years, is shoot for drop data. And so I shot out to our 960 targets, and zero. I checked my zero; it was correct. And then I went out to 960 and dialed to about what I thought it would be, and then I came back with a number. I don't remember what that number was. And in this Creedmoor, I plugged that number in, and it kind of calculates at 2,700 feet per second is where it was at. Next day I go out and shoot that over a chronograph and, over lab radar, and lab radar says 2725. So I come back in and plug that into the truing feature on the, on that Revic app. And what did it do? It dropped that BC on that 140 ELDM from 326 as published down to a 310. And come to think about it, well, that's an 8 twist instead of a 7.5 twist. So that thing has less RPMs. We have a lower BC with that bullet. Yeah. And so my chronograph told me 2725. And then when I came back and plugged it in, back calculated it with a back in the truing feature, it said you can adjust your velocity to 2700, or you can adjust your BC to 310. So my 2700 was perfect, right? Out there. But actually I was shooting 2725, but my BC was lower, so it made up for 25 feet a second variance at 960 yards. And 25 feet a second variance is actually quite a bit. Right? It ended up being, if I did that just strictly by velocity, and I called the BC as gospel, then I was shooting, what was it, 3/4 MOA difference at that distance, and that's 7 inches. Call it 7 inches. That's a miss. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
So there's a couple ways to go about that. And if you have a chronograph, something like a lab radar, I think that's holds a little more water than the rated BC from the manufacturer. Which BCs is like, the higher the number you can rate that BC, the better that thing shows on the box on the shelf, right? That makes this 140 bullet better than that 140 bullet because it's got a lower drag, function. Yeah. And so whether it does or not really depends on the setup that it's in. Yeah. So a little bit of marketing in that one. Yeah. So, man, I kind of blew through your whole list of to-dos here, huh?
Hey, that's great. Let's keep it short and sweet. Some good stuff covered here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Yeah, I think we pretty much hit it.
Yeah.
We walked through the truing process, and I guess the last thing we could talk about is zero range versus zero angle.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions on that. And really zero range is kind of what everyone's used to thinking about. Where we sight our rifle in at 100 yards, therefore our zero range is 100 yards, and it's a very easy concept for people to grasp. Yep. And the slight downside to running on a zero range mode is that if I go to vastly different atmospherics, let's say I go from 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet, and I don't re-zero at 100 yards when I get there. Yeah. I just go straight out and go hunting. Is that when the computer is calculating the effect of atmospherics on the trajectory of my bullet, it's only calculating from 100 yards to the target. So it still assumes that my 100-yard zero is perfect.
Yeah.
The reality is for most hunting ranges, 8,000 feet of elevation is probably not going to make enough difference in your 100-yard zero that you can even really see it. Okay. But if you're starting to do some extreme long range shooting, then calculating for that 100 yards from the muzzle to your zero range will get you a little bit more accurate data.
Yeah.
So now I'll walk through the process on switching over to zero angle mode. So I have this profile I was just working with. We zeroed it at 100. We trued it with 19.5 minutes at 800 yards. And so when I open up that profile, it's set in zero range mode based on 100-yard zero. And when we true it, we have to keep it in that zero range mode. But once I've trued it, I can switch it to zero angle. And what it's going to do is, based upon my scope height and the distance and the atmospherics, is this going to capture and calculate the angle between the line of sight and the line of departure. So I hit find. I confirm that all my velocity, zero range, environmentals, and all that stuff are correct. I hit calculate, and then I hit set. And now it's in zero angle mode. And so the benefit I get from this is now when I go to a different environmental without re-zeroing my rifle at 100 yards, it's going to calculate the changes of air density all the way back to my muzzle rather than just from the target back to 100 yards. It's no longer going to assume that my 100-yard zero is perfect. And so it does give you a slight edge on getting a good accurate calculation on, say, an 800 or 1,000-yard shot. Yeah. Especially if you zeroed at 5,000 feet, but now we've hiked up to 10,000 feet.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Now we just have to shoot well enough to be able to see that variance.
I'm not sure I can shoot well enough to see that variance, but hey, it's
like you say, it
getting rid of
extrapolates,
excuses.
Right.
it extrapolates over distance. So
Yeah,
in your normal hunting ranges, you probably won't see it, but
yeah,
we're looking for precise. Like we need our equipment to be as precise as possible. That way we can have a little more fuzz on the human error part.
yeah, yep, absolutely.
No, I like it. I think that's a couple good topics to cover.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think we wrapped it up pretty good.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on again today, guys. It's been a pleasure. As always, if you have any suggestions or topics you'd like to discuss, hit us up at podcast@gunworks.com, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
If you like what you're hearing here, please take a second and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. We appreciate your feedback and suggestions for topics you'd like discussed or questions you want answered on the podcast. You can reach out on Facebook or Instagram or send us an email to podcast@gunworks.com. Also, be sure and check out our full offering of long-range gear at gunworks.com. Use promo code LRP for free shipping on any order.